Flanders' source singers or informants were elderly and many were women. Among them were Anna Ho, Elwyn Burdett, and Olive May. Other informants included Jonathan Moses, Winifred Haley, and Harford Hayes. Flanders appreciated the worth and hardships of those sharing the ballads and had personal relationships with their families. She often traveled great distances to record her rural informants, and here is her account of visiting Charles Finnemore's family.
And I tripled over, I don't know how many hundred miles from an uncertain address to come into his yard one evening about 5:30. I wanted to be sure he was home and that I could call upon him in the evening. We'd driven down from Mars Hill, Maine, expecting to go right back and have our supper. It was in Bridgewater where Mr. Finnemore lived. He said, we've had our supper, and he invited me in. I was also with my assistant, Miss Alden. We came in, we were listening until after 10 o'clock, one ballad after another, and suddenly I remembered how hungry I was. I'm glad to say that Mrs. Finnemore stopped to think about it, and she set us down to the most delicious supper. I've never forgotten it. Delightful cooking.
Flanders authored or co-authored 9 publications of her collected New England folk music, including the series of child ballads, ancient ballads traditionally sung in New England, to which Tristram Coffin contributed the analysis. During her first decade of fieldwork across New England, Flanders obtained, transcribed, annotated, and organized over 9,000 pieces of folk music, more than 4,000 of which were recorded. In 1941, she made a gift of her collection to Middlebury College in Vermont. Here she is shown making the official presentation with one of her most important informants, Asa Davis of Vermont. Despite recognition of Flanders' legacy as a field collector, her equally important and groundbreaking work as a promoter, lecturer, and educator has received comparatively little attention. From the beginning of her work in the 1930s, and through the 1940s, Flanders presented an extensive series of lecture recitals featuring New England singers in regional forums. These included presentations at the Boston Public Library, Dartmouth, Wellesley, and many other New England colleges and historical societies. In 1942, she gave a lecture recital at the Natural History Museum in New York City. In November of 1945, Flanders and 5 informants gave a 2-evening performance of traditional ballads at Harvard University. Shown here are Flanders and her longtime assistant, Marguerite Olney, together with Asa Davis and Jonathan Moses, 2 of her most important source singers. Also shown is Lena Bourne Granny Fish, who had an extensive repertoire and often accompanied Mrs. Flanders to regional concerts. Elmer George, another important informant, also participated in the Harvard concerts, which were attended by prominent New Englanders such as noted poet Robert Frost. In late 1947, Flanders proposed a program of New England ballads to Harold Spivak, the chief of the Library of Congress Music Division. She was concerned that many of the singers were aging and felt the cultural values of folk song should be known firsthand while they could be given audiences whose heritage they are. When the lecture recital was announced, a Washington Post Society column noted that one of the most interesting senators' wives flocking back to Washington was having some of her ballads sung. It concluded that, not so incidentally, she was slight, smartly attired, and altogether an enchanting person. The always poised Mrs. Flanders was aware of the advantages her privileged political, financial, and social position afforded, and adept at employing means to her ends. She also knew her own worth and that of the folk songs to which she devoted her resources and talents. On February 27, 1948, Flanders presented New England balladry to a sold-out house of 525 at the Coolidge Auditorium. Over 200 more people listened to the program in the anteroom. The performance by New Englanders of their a cappella folk songs in this venue and before this distinguished audience was groundbreaking. So was Flanders' presence as a female lecturer and published authority on ballads. She was again accompanied by Asa Davis and Elmer George of Vermont, whom you have just seen in the Harvard photos. Jonathan Moses was, however, too ill to travel, causing Flanders to revise the program and recruit Charles Fenimore of Maine as a short notice replacement. Here is Flanders herself introducing her singers.
And I'd like to continue introductions. With me this evening are Mr. Elmer George in the middle, who with members of his family can sit around and sing all night without repeating a song, not once. Mr. Asa Davis, who treasures many songs known to his Irish forebears, he is furthest from me. And Mr. Charles Fenimore from Aroostook County, Maine, whose ballads were learned among river drivers on the East Branch of Penobscot. Is that right? We will all know each other better as the evening wears on.
Throughout that evening, Flanders engaged her audience with narratives encapsulating the history of the ballads and their relationship to American ideals. The most important themes included social equality, individual liberty, the paramountcy of personal merit over wealth, and wit. In introducing Robin Hood rescuing the three squires, Flanders analogized New Englanders' egalitarian, independent, and adventurous self-image, saying
that one man in Lincoln Forest had the temerity to live his own life off the rich, express his own creed, give to the poor, and choose his own form of recreation, hunting, archery, disguises, and pranks. Tales of Robin Hood delighted them in his plays of wit, in his caprices with would-be captors, and fellowship with his merry men all.
In Mr. Fenimore's ballad, Robin Hood encounters a woman weeping for her sons, who are to be hanged for killing the king's deer. He exchanges clothes with a beggar, meets the high sheriff, and volunteers to be hangman if he can blow his horn so the sons' souls reach heaven. When he does, his men appear to the rescue, leaving the sheriff chagrined.
Was his bugle horn to his mouth, he blew it loud and shrill. 110 of bold Robin Hood's men come tippling over the hill. Whose men, then cried the high sheriff, whose men, I pray, tell me. They're mine and not thine, said bold Robin Hood, come to borrow three squires of thee. Oh, take them, then cried the high sheriff. Oh, take them, cried he. But there's not another beggar in all the king hath could borrow three more of me.
Although overnight train travel and conventions of the time prevented New England women informants' participation in the national program, Flanders represented them through her own presence and her unique selection of ballads. In most child ballads, women are subordinate, more acted upon than acting, and often the object of tacit morality lessons. In contrast, Flanders' program included several ballads reflecting daughters' freedom in marriage, or more generally portraying female characters as clever, brave, and able to affect or even control the narrative. The Bold Soldier was a lively ballad performed by Mr. George. A young woman is encountered by her father's armed men and discovered to have married a soldier. A sword fight ensues. The father offers the soldier £10,000 to leave off, but the daughter wisely instructs him to fight on.
And then up speaks the old man, saying, if you'll but spare my life, I'll give you £10,000 and my daughter for your wife. Fight on, cries the lady, your portion is too small. Oh, stay your hand, the old man says, and you shall have it all. The old man took him home with him and acknowledged him as his heir. 'Twas not because he loved him, but it was for dread and fear. There never was a soldier who's fit to carry a gun, that'd either flinch or stir an inch till the battle he had won. Despise not a soldier because that he is poor. He's as happy on the battlefield as at the barracks door. He's brave, brisk, and bold, he's sociable and free, and he's just as willing to fight for love as he is for liberty.
The House Carpenter, a New England version of James Harris or The Demon Lover, also presented an autonomous woman. In earlier English versions, the spirit of a former sweetheart or devil typically seduces a woman, drowns, and damns her. In Mr. George's sometimes humorous version, a married woman meets a seaman who offers his ships and crew if she will forsake her family. She leaves her baby to her husband, dresses, and sails away.
She took her babe all in her arms. She gave him kisses 3. Stay at home with your own father dear, for he's good company. Stay at home with your own father dear, for he's good company. Then she went upstairs to dress herself, most beautiful to behold. And then she walked the streets all along, and she shone like the glittering gold.
Within a few weeks, she has regrets. Within a few more, the ship springs a leak and she and her lover abruptly drown, subject to the same ill fate.
I do not mourn for gold, she cried. I do not mourn for thee, but I do mourn for my house carpenter, and likewise my fair baby. But I do mourn for my house carpenter, and likewise my fair baby. But she had not sailed 8 weeks on the sea. Oh no, not more than 4, before that a hole in the ship sprang a leak, and this mourner was hurt no more.
The importance of Flanders' work as a collector cannot be overstated. Folk songs provide narratives critical to our understanding of identity. As Mrs. Flanders observed at the conclusion of her lecture, the words and tunes of ballads are flavored with the humors, reflections, arguments, beliefs, and emotions of people. She preserved thousands of ballads and was influential in the preservation of countless more. Flanders devoted her life to the presentation as well as collection of New England ballads because she felt the pressing importance that folk songs be known firsthand. At the time of her Library of Congress lecture recital, America had survived the Great Depression. President Roosevelt's expansive New Deal had been founded. World War II had ended. But fear of communism was intensifying. In 1947, President Truman issued a loyalty order, and the FBI's Director Hoover was compiling extensive files on citizens. The ballads Flanders selected provided a powerful reminder of America's founding values: social equality, individual freedom, nobility of character, and the rights of all men and women. A new generation of folklorists and folk musicians is coming of age in an America which again needs to reimagine itself in trying times. Because of women like Helen Hartness Flanders, we have songs that provide a critical touch point to our truest history, and to the emotional truths that connect everyone to the ageless community of humanity and give the deepest meaning to our lives. These are the links to Flanders' archival materials at Middlebury College and the Library of Congress, which I will post into the chat for those who are interested. Thank you.
I think am I unmuted? Yes. Yep. Everybody's clapping. Everybody loved it. That was great, Nora. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, if anybody wants to make a comment, you have to go down to the participants and click on the hand. Has anybody done that?
The echo back.
Is the echo back? Okay, sorry. Is there anybody who wants to say anything to Nora? That was really splendid, Nora. Thank you.
Thank you.
But I don't see any questions or comments. Yes, Brian Miller. Brian Miller's got a hand up.
Yeah, just to say thanks. It was a great presentation, and the fact that her recordings have been made available online through archive.org. It's just an incredible resource if people don't know about that. I mean, somebody told me about it and then it took me a while to delve into it, but I've really been deep in it lately, and I really love that Charles Fenimore especially. So it's a great resource to be able to listen to all that stuff from your home, especially during these times. I don't know if you know, Nora, what percentage of her recordings would be represented in that online offering? Do you? Or
I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's a lot of stuff though. It's a lot of.
Yes.
Anyway, thanks. That was really great.
Thank you. David has his hand up, but I don't know which David. Just says David. You have to unmute yourself, whichever.
Yeah, it might be me. I've got a question anyway. David Sutcliffe.
Hello, David.
Really enjoyed the presentation, Nora. Thank you very much. I'm afraid I didn't quite see Helen Flanders' birth date and death date. Did she feed into what is loosely called the second folk revival? Did artists, I don't know, Joan Baez, Bob Dylan, anybody of that kind of, did they feed into her work at all?
Well, Margaret MacArthur, who was also a collector in Vermont, but much later than Flanders, she worked with a lot of Flanders material, and she had a correspondence with Flanders near the end of Flanders' life, and so she was influential in spreading a lot of that around Vermont.
Did she say about the
Yes, and her books, I think, are also used quite a bit because especially her ballads, Migrant in New England, and her ancient ballads traditionally sung in New England can be very useful for the versions of Vermont and New England ballads, child ballads.
Thank you. Tim Edwards was next.
Steve, could we have a second? Could we ask people not to unmute themselves until they're invited to do so?
Right, you have been told. Tim Edwards.
Okay, well, again, thanks very much, Nora. I was regrettably very ignorant, but I'm a lot less ignorant now, and thanks very much for the talk. I really enjoyed it. One thing I was interested in was that the quality of the singing I thought was remarkably high.
Yes.
And I was just wondering what age the singers were when those recordings were made.
Well, those were all from the Library of Congress lecture recital in 1948, and all three informants were in their 70s and 80s.
That's pretty impressive.
Yes.
It's pretty impressive. Thank you very much.
Elizabeth Higgins, Lisa. Unmute yourself. Yep.
Yeah. Nora, I thought it was wonderful. I never knew Helen herself, but I was very close to Margaret MacArthur, who was very much influenced by Margaret. Two things I'm interested in. One is I've become aware of the things she collected in Maine that are still at the University of Maine. I think maybe copies of them are now down at the Library of Congress. But so I wondered if you had done any contact with some of the people who were working with that material. I should also say she did collect quite a bit of fiddle music from Maine, which is extremely interesting. In response to the people who asked if she'd had an impact on people in the music revival, I would say I was coming of age during the folk music revival, and I had no idea about this stuff, except that I'd found copies of her books. But when I wanted to get hold of the material at Middlebury, I could not get hold of it. It was very much under lock and key at that time. And any of us who wanted to get hold of that material basically had to go through Margaret MacArthur, who had had a little bit more access than the rest of us. Mm-hmm. But there was a lot of pain and discomfort among a lot of people who were interested in traditional music and the folk music revival, because we couldn't get hold of the material in Maine. And then when we pursued at Middlebury College, and for a long time, we were told that the problem was a logjam between Margaret Olney, who had been her assistant, and other people at Middlebury, and how and when the material should be released. And I know this was a source of great frustration for Margaret MacArthur. But now, of course, it's been made available to many of us. But I will say that when we began to sing this material at the tag end of the folk music revival, people didn't know how to deal with it. They'd call it an English ballad. It didn't compute to them that that there was a rich ballad tradition in New England. And that's why I chose to specialize in it, because I come from New England. And it was very, very difficult. Margaret MacArthur, who was doing a very heavy repertoire of Flanders materials and things that she herself had collected personally in New England, couldn't get an opening in the folk music revival. Festivals wouldn't hire her because she wasn't traditional enough. Revival people wouldn't hire her because she wasn't commercial enough. And most people regarded her and New England material as some sort of a strange artifact from the past that was not germane to the American experience.
Elizabeth, thank you. I'm sorry, we're going to have to move on because I've still got two people waiting with their hands up. Thank you for that. David Ingerson. David, where are you?
Right, trying to unmute myself. Yeah, thank you, Nora. That was wonderful. My question has to do with the part of your title in relation to the patriarchy. I'm wondering if you ran across any explicit or implicit problems that Flanders ran into because she was a woman.
Well, she didn't have nearly as many problems as several other New England women collectors who were collecting at the same time, because she had quite a bit of influence. She had a very strong education, and she was the daughter of a governor and the wife of a senator. And so she was sort of much better accepted by the academics who were in the collecting, and by the Library of Congress and the institutions. So there were some societal norms that made it a little bit more difficult because of her gender, but she was fairly lucky in her position, so that didn't hinder her particularly much. But she still was it was quite different for there to be such a prominent collector who was a woman.
Nice, thank you.
Thank you. Last question for Nora, I think. Ian Russell.
Hi, Steve. Hi, Nora. Very much enjoyed that presentation. Nora did a really careful, thoughtful job, and some wonderful examples. Much appreciated. As I was listening, and you touched on the 1950s, what sort of relationship did Flanders have with John and Alan Lomax? Have you picked up on that at all? Because they came from very different necks of the woods, and of course Lomax became a person non grata in the early 50s as well. Hence he fled to the UK, or left for the UK. Let's put it that way, sensibly. I wonder if you picked up on any sort of correspondence between Flanders and the Lomaxes.
Yes, her dealings were much more with sort of higher people in the Library of Congress, but she did have some correspondence with the Lomaxes. There was a little bit of tension between her and the Library of Congress in general because of the way that she left her materials to Middlebury instead of the Library of Congress. They were not as happy about that development, but she was well respected, and she did have generally amicable dealings with the Library of Congress, and so she and the Lomaxes didn't really cross paths overly much, since they were focusing on different areas usually. Yeah, so there is some correspondence.
So none of the singers were in common from the two collectors, or from, for example, Anne and Frank Warner, or any of the others working at the time.
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, I said, so you're saying their paths didn't really cross in the field. So did Helen Hartness Flanders' path cross with, for example, Anne and Frank Warner? Did it cross with any other field workers at the time?
Less so. Actually, she did have a little bit of field work with the Lomaxes, because they're Alan Lomax in particular. She and Alan Lomax, for a short period of time, would work together. They'd collect together, because when they were focusing on the same people in the same areas, but she generally worked alone. Well, with her group of with Marguerite Olney and her informants and things, but not usually with other collectors.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. I know I said that was the last one, but Seven Savage? Seven? You got your hand up? Seven, sorry, I don't know who Seven Savage is, but they've got their hand up. Are you unmuted? No, okay. I got a Flanders story. I've just remembered this. Middlebury did issue an LP, didn't they, of her recordings, and an English collector called Mervyn Plunkett. Many of you older ones will heard of Mervyn. He used to play it to people to test them, to say what part of England do these ballads come from. He did it to me when I first met him. And I'm glad to say that I spotted that it was American, but his point was that the ballads did sound very English. He reckoned sort of Warwickshire sort of accent. And Mervyn knew quite a lot about these things. So it was fascinating for him, how British the whole lot sounded. Anyway, I think we better move on. So everybody clap your hands on the screen for Nora again. Because that was great. Thank you. Now we're moving on to our panel. Sue Allen, David Atkinson, Vic Gammon, and John Malden. We had Julia Bishop was originally planned to be on the panel, but she has to. It's her husband's birthday of all things, so she has to do family things. And Sandra Kerr isn't well. So we're down to 4, but that's fine. And again, we'll try putting your little blue hand up if you want to say something. But we've had a few questions. We haven't been inundated with questions, but we've had 1 or 2 sent in. So we're going to do those. And if this whole thing works, then we will obviously do another panel session in the future. But the first question that I'm going to put to the 4 of them, and they don't have to answer if they don't want to. Assuming that you, like most of the rest of us, came to folk or traditional song as either as a performer or as a listener at a folk club or something. I think most of us do that. How did you, or when, or where, or how did you then move into what we call research, into looking into it rather than just enjoying it? And if there are there may be some new people listening who want to make that move. So how did you do it, and how do you think people should do it if they want to make that move? So anybody of you 4 wants to start off, please do. Yeah, Vic's got his hand up. Vic, are you unmuted?
I just unmuted myself.
Good.
Well, it was the 50s. It was the radio broadcast, first of all, as I roved out, which it was just so different from anything else I'd ever heard. It was Peter Kennedy, it was Bob Copper, it was Seamus Ennis and people like that, just producing these recordings of mostly unaccompanied singers, and it was tremendous. I mean, on the top of that, there came the skiffle thing. Now, I was only about 10 then, but that's really when I date the sort of 53. I moved in 56, so I must have, I was interested in this stuff before I was 10, really. And then it developed on from that. And I went to university as a late student and not really thinking of doing research in that area. And I did history, and I still think that's the best training you can have for anything, but that's a personal bias, and I would accept it as a bias. But 2 things. I mean, Bert Lloyd's work was very important to me, although I have been very critical of him. He still got me at that interest between history and song. And one of my when I did an MA, one of my master's papers was on Lloyd's notion of erotic song and so on. It was about that. But this links to another question we've had, really. The real thing that booted me into doing something more than that was finding good source material. And I found the McDermott collection of church music. And I'm still just trying to finish a piece on church music. Now it's an interest, and it relates in that it's part of village culture and village music and so on, and you know, with the Thomas Hardy links and so on. So it really became a sort of almost the thing that interested me most. I think that's what you've got to have. You've got to have that driving interest, but I also think some good methodology. Some, you know, I never was sorry to have studied historiography as a, you know, how you do it, how you use evidence, that sort of thing. I think that's really good, those two things. But that's how I got going, and I never looked back, really. It's just shaped the whole of my life.
Well, thank you. I think John put his hand up.
Yes, I did. As far as I was concerned, I was simply a sucker for songs. From the age of 9 or thereabouts, I can remember getting songbooks from here and there from my sister, swapping them with members of staff at the school I was, and simply loving songs. And it was only later on when the folk music revival started around Belfast in the late 1950s, early 1960s, that I started realizing that people didn't like these songs in the same way that I did, in that I found them enormously important because of the way they represented life and the way they seemed to be real, in that they were to do with real situations. But I started looking at them in order to try to persuade other people to like them, and found that was a rather fruitless business, because if they hadn't liked the songs in the first place, they weren't going to listen to me. But it went on in that way, and I simply started giving talks, started arguing to people who were already to some extent converted, and my own discipline very, very haphazardly developed from that. And later on, though, one thing was absolutely crucial in leaning me towards research rather than performance, apart from the fact that I wasn't that good a performer. In 1969, I published my first written printed article. And the same evening as I delivered it to the publisher, the first deaths of the Northern Ireland Troubles occurred. And that because it constituted almost for me a lockdown. I couldn't go into Belfast. I couldn't have any more fun. So I sat at home doing it vicariously with books and recordings, and that's where it landed me. But all of my work initially was haphazard, and I largely developed my methodology as I went along from what other people were saying and from what I guessed myself. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, John. Sue. Yes, Sue?
Yeah. Well, I came into it quite differently, I think. Interested in performing. Well, I learnt guitar probably 14, and actually came at it first from American songs through the Joan Baez songbook, which I'm sure a lot of you remember. And I found I loved the ones that were called child ballads, whatever that meant, which I didn't know when I was that age. But I got transported by some of these, got my guitar and started playing folk clubs locally, and then in college in London, around London as well, where I discovered Cecil Sharp House and clog dancing and all sorts of other things. But when I came back, I found there was a local repertoire, and I also got involved with a K band, and I became passionate about finding my own songs, my own tunes from my area, which for those of you who don't know is Cumberland and Westmoreland, now the county of Cumbria in northern England. And so my focus has always been on place first and then the songs, which has meant that I haven't looked at one genre particularly of songs, but everything that could be found in my place which included dialect songs and hunting songs, but also a range of other material. And there was such a wealth of tunes, and I got into dances as well. And so all the time I was performing, I was informally researching for my own repertoire, and gradually started writing informally about it until I decided I had to pull this all together, probably into a book, but I needed someone to set me an external deadline. So I signed up to do a PhD at Lancaster University with a wonderful history department, and I totally agree with Vic, who was my external examiner, by the way, that history training is superb for that. So it's been a very slow progress. I mean, I didn't start my PhD till I was in my 50s, and it took me 10 years of part-time work. So that is how I came to it. And I remain obsessed with place, with Cumbria and its repertoire, because it's so little known. I really want to get it out there.
Thank you, Sue. It's interesting that so far everybody's talked about history as a background, as a discipline that you need, rather than music, which I find heartening because I can't read music. David, what do you?
Yeah, well, like I think quite a few people of my generation, whatever that is, I came to it through folk rock bands like Fairport Convention. John Peel used to play a lot of folk revival stuff on his programs on Radio 1, and this was sort of into the 70s when the bands that previously one had been listening to, the Pink Floyds of the world, had become so megalomaniacal that it was refreshing to find something more interesting, and I think lyrically actually much more coherent and rewarding, because my background is in literature. And I was going to folk clubs and that quite a lot at that sort of time. I knew that having retired at the peak of my career as a bass guitarist, aged about 15, I had no future in performing. And as I oh, sorry, this is a nuisance. As a sort of unexpected spin-off of my my PhD research, which was in marriage systems in early modern drama, it struck me that there was a certain amount in the content of child ballads, and actually particularly the Demon Lover House Carpenter ballad, that I thought I could work up into an article. And I got into researching it from that point of view, and the ballads generally, and at that time I was thinking child ballads, so I wouldn't restrict it to that. Now tend to be the most literarily rewarding area of the repertoire to pursue. And yeah, again, subsequently I've come much more to the history of it as well. I don't have a formal training in history. So no music, Steve, any among?
No, that's
I was
good.
performing. I was performing all the time, but in an amateur way, but not studying it academically.
Yeah, can I just come away from the panel for the moment? Nora, are you still there, Nora, as a young person? Unmute yourself. How did you get started? Because they're talking about the 50s and 60s.
70s.
70s, sorry, 70s.
50s.
So what's it like in the 2000s and 20s?
Yes, well, I got started because I'd listened to a lot of Joan Baez, because nobody in my family is musical, but my father would play Joan Baez CDs. And so I wanted to sing Joan Baez ballads, and sort of where it all got started. And then I got, to be a part of the community, and I'd go to programs and things. And I don't know, it just all took off from there.
Right. Okay. So that started us off. Now the next, nobody's put their hand up, so that's a good sign. The next question we had was from Gemma, and it's a very complicated question of 3 paragraphs about child ballads, specifically about Clark Colville and Lady Alice, the child ballads 42 and 85. Oh, somebody has put their hand up now, but we'll come back to that, Anne. So we can't answer, Gemma, we can't answer now because we will spend the next 2 hours doing it, but you'll get an email from somebody. But David, have you looked into child?
Can I just play for time for a moment because I need to send a text?
Oh, right.
Sorry about this.
Okay. I've got a hand up from Bidisha, is it? Somebody called Bidisha somewhere?
Yes. Okay, so I am working on wedding songs. I am from India, and
Yes.
I wanted to, I am in the first year and I don't know much, how to proceed with the methodology. I've just begun with my work. So my question is, how do I see this music part, or how do I see this music in performance when this group of women, they sing together? How do I analyze that part in my thesis?
Right, sorry. Are you talking about Indian music or British?
Yeah. No, I'm talking about Indian music.
Indian music.
Yeah, wedding songs.
Wedding songs, okay.
Yeah.
Can anybody help Vidisha with Indian wedding songs? I'm not sure that comes into any of our experience, but somebody here might.
Has there been
I would say something if I could.
Peggy, yes?
Yes, you could check out the work, unless you already know it, of Kiran Narayan. Her newest book, Everyday Creativity, is on Indian women's songs. And I think that and contacting Kiran, who works in Australia, would be a really good contact for you, Bidisha.
Okay, thank you, ma'am.
Peggy, could you type that out onto the chat?
Yes.
So that we can, the spelling of the names that you're talking about and stuff, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Vidisha. David, are you back again?
Yeah, sorry about that. Right, yeah. What's the question, Giles Collins, Lady Alice?
That's right. It was about Clark Colville.
Oh, Clark Colville, yeah.
And Lady Alice, child 42 and 85. Whether are they the same ballad or extensions of the same story, or are they different things?
They're completely different things. They have certain sort of motifs in common, I think. But we have to acknowledge that there's a certain body of scholarship that does claim that they are the same thing. And that's become sort of part of the, as it were, received wisdom around that ballad. So it's quite difficult to get away from the sort of child 42/85 nomenclature. It's quite hard to see why Child actually included Lady Alice at all, because if you look at it in his volume, there's virtually nothing to it. It's because it slightly echoes Lord Lovell in the man coming home to tell his mother that he's going to die, which I guess is all the thing to do if you're feeling peaky.
This does bring up one of the problems is that, once somebody has said, well, especially if Child has said it, that these two are similar or the same, then that gets repeated by everybody, including me.
Well, it's always a sticky wicket when you get into what constitutes, quote unquote, the same song. That's always been, I don't know if it's an irresolvable problem, but we can get into the weeds.
Yeah, is there an article, David, about this particular?
There is, yes. I don't know how to do this at the moment, but I can send you the reference. I've written about it. It's in a book, so it's not that easy for me to scan it or anything for anybody, but I can give you the reference.
Can you type the reference into the chat sometime by the end of today's meeting? That's this thing, I think.
Okay, I'll try and do that. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, Child obviously didn't think they were the same because he gave them different numbers.
That's right.
So
Yes.
at least we're on sort of safe ground in that respect.
But since then, it's become the orthodoxy, you say?
Yes, yeah. I mean, there's a desire to see the female figure as some kind of supernatural sort of figure, which it kind of is in Clark Colville, but sort of fairly obviously isn't in George Collins.
And it does. Clark Colville does call her a mermaid.
Oh yes, she's a mermaid. You can see her fishy tail.
Yes,
in
right.
Clark Colville. But yeah, the woman in George Collins is washing her marble stone. I mean, she wouldn't be able to balance on a fishy tail if she was doing that anyway.
Never tried that. Okay. Shall we move on to the next question that we had from Ben Schwartz? I don't know if Ben is with us. So are you paying attention, panel? If today you were to select an unsettled or controversial topic for a thesis, what would that be? Now, you've all four of you have got doctorates, so you all know all about writing theses. But he specifically said an unsettled or controversial topic. Any of you want to have a go with that? So
I would just like to say, and it refers back to what you said, that we'd all studied history and not music. I think we really need more musicians to come into the field. And because I would like to know a lot more about modes, which I keep asking Julia Bishop every time I see her, and I still don't get my head around some of the things that she tells me. I'm also interested in the hunting songs of Cumbria. What were their tunes? But I don't need to research that because we've got Mary Emmett, who's actually in this meeting, is doing that research right now, which is fabulous. But I think we have a lot less on tunes than we have generally on the songs, but we also have less on the performers and how they performed. I think that's another fee. Contemporary descriptions of actual performances by traditional singers we need more of, I think.
Yeah, if we can find them.
If we can find them.
Yeah, that's one of the problems, isn't it? Anything else from the panel, unsettled or controversial?
I could say something. I mean, I think the first thing is to really find a body of good material if you're going to do an extensive. I mean, the wonderful thing I was saying earlier, when I discovered the McDermott collection, I walked into this old library of the Sussex Archaeological Society, and I didn't find 1 or 2 manuscript books. I found 25 manuscript books, and I found McDermott's own collection of scrapbook stuff. He'd been sort of trying to collect information about old church music from the 1890s, and he'd been interviewing people that went back to the 1830s and 40s. And I thought, Christ, you've got to be able to do something good with this material. I mean, I've just read a thesis, which is a good piece of work. I won't say who it's by, but it's by someone who's trained in music. And the thing I'd say to Sue, she'd probably agree with me, is that musicians bring a hell of a lot of baggage and preconceptions with them. I mean, I did study an amount of music at school, but they bring a whole load of assumptions, which they find it extraordinarily hard to get rid of. You know, which that you're always in that position of judging something by something else. And I don't think you can judge traditional music by something else. You've got to say it's its own thing, and let's try and understand it. You know, I'm not saying there's never going to be someone who's been trained in music who's not going to do well in this field, but it is interesting that the backgrounds are usually history, literature, social studies of some sort. I wouldn't worry so much. I mean, well, certainly identify a problem. And you've got to believe in that problem. There's no use me telling you what the problem is. You've got to believe in it. But then, is there going to be enough material? Now, the resources have opened up enormously in the past. Having just done this work for a book that Steve's going to edit on church music. I first did my thing on church music in 1976. You know, and then it was all about scrabbling around libraries and, you know, some hours and hours in the British Library and waiting for the books to arrive and all that. I mean, there's an amount of just sheer detail, what with the newspaper archives, the 18th century collection online, all that stuff, you know, there's just masses of stuff there, but you've got to have it's no use to me telling someone else what to research. I mean, I certainly talk it through with them, certainly happy. I mean, people do find, shall I do this? Is this a good, interesting thing to do? And I'm very happy to do that. But you know, you've got to believe in your thing, but then you've got to check there's enough stuff there. The thesis I've just read, they were going to prove this, I mean, I don't want to get into too much detail. They're going to prove this very interesting idea by looking at this body of material. And when they came down to it, the stuff wasn't there. I mean, it's like grasping at a fiction that didn't happen. So, I mean, I think one thing to do if you're going to set off in a research project is talk it through with people. I mean, if it's interesting, personally, I never mind talking to people if what they've got to deal with is interesting. And I think that goes for a lot of us.
Yeah.
So don't, you know, don't give up.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and I don't know why this is. I mean, I'm a member of the Society for Ethnomusicology, but there's almost nothing. There are so few people doing ballad-related stuff. You know, the kinds of things that I do. I can't really find a whole lot of people within SEM, and I don't know very much. There's also a British folk forum for ethnomusicology. And I mean, I don't know why there is that sort of disconnect.
No, I don't know either. I'm sorry, I don't know who that was just talking.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Marge Steiner.
Oh, hello, Margaret. Yes.
Yeah. In Bloomington.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
are you Steve?
Yeah, I'm Steve. Yes.
Hi, Steve. I'm glad to hear your voice finally.
Yes, and same for you. Yes.
Yes.
John or David, do you want to say anything on this topic?
Okay, if I will, I don't want to interrupt David, and it's so good actually to see so many people that I've met once or twice and enormously appreciate the work that they do. But as far as I'm concerned, I don't know that it's worth a thesis, but I do think it's worth thinking about. I would like to see what would happen if we abandoned the usual words that we use to describe the songs that people sing. In that, I don't like the word folk.
No.
I've written about why I might abandon the word folk in this volume. I also would abandon the word ballad because it doesn't refer to a song from my point of view. In my understanding, it refers to, and this is how the people said it, and I think it's very important for us to look at what the people did, the people said, the people felt, and not to impose our own either nomenclature or our own ideas upon this material. The people used the word ballad to describe quite simply a piece of paper, either with printed song words or a manuscript song words. I would also like to abandon the word chapbook, because in Ireland, certainly, they were called ballads. They were called ballads purely and simply because they had words of songs on them. And they were sold unfolded. So it was a sheet. It was a ballad sheet. And I would also like, I must admit, to abandon the word version, because there is an implication in the word version that we've got something which was original and which has necessarily subsequent renditions have been either debased or slightly altered, and they don't quite hold up to what is in the original. Now, during the course of writing, I was asked to write for a history of Irish working class writing. And in attempting to explain to literary people, people who were concentrating on writing, what I felt happened when a song was altered, I wrote this. In general, changes in orally transmitted and printed vernacular songs seek to remedy the loss of sense that is inherent in a change of horizon, mental or physical. In other words, instead of saying this is a lack a loss of sense. This is a re-establishment of sense in the new circumstance. Now, as I say, I would just like to see what happens if we do that. And it's controversial, I think, perhaps. On the other hand, you may all have thought it for yourselves, but I'm glad I said it.
Well, I would say I agree with you entirely that the words we use are useless, but unfortunately we can't do without them. I wrote a book for Faber last couple of years ago, and I called it Folk Song in England, not because I wanted to, but because Faber said, if you call it a social history of vernacular, utterance or something, nobody's going to buy the bloody thing. So they in effect forced me to use the word folk, because that meant people at least had some idea, not really what I meant, but by the word, but at least some idea, because we've got to talk to the people outside ourselves. That's the problem, outside our little group. David, have you got something?
Yeah, I mean scholarship inevitably builds on its preceding analytical categories, and you can change them and develop them, but I don't think you can sort of simply throw the baby out with the bathwater. But anyway, what was I was going to suggest as a controversial topic. I mean, I'm mainly working in the 18th century now, and I don't really believe in anything beyond the Napoleonic Wars any longer. It's all rubbish now. But looking at ballads or narrative songs or printed verses, if you like, the child ballads, which we tend to sort of admire the most, Child's collection completely misrepresents the 18th century, and that would be an area that somebody might care to look at. So I'm partly doing it, but I'm not really taking the angle of sort of saying that Child got it all wrong, because that's kind of dangerous territory. But he did. I mean, it's been said before that Child ballads are only a set of ballads that Child particularly liked, and there's 305, of which about 30 perhaps would actually really like. There's quite a lot of rubbish in there. And the other element, of course, is heavily biased towards Scotland for perfectly understandable historical reasons, but it tells us virtually nothing about vernacular singing, vernacular song, vernacular verse in England. So that's an area somebody could do. If somebody's going to do it, then I won't bother and just rip off their findings later on.
Volunteers on a postcard.
Yeah.
Lisa Null has her hand up. Lisa, where are you?
Hi, I'm speaking out in defense of the use of the word folk. And I'm speaking with probably an American perspective on it. Folk music definitely means in America's its past. When I think of America, I think of two major folk revivals, one in the 50s and 60s and one in the 30s ending in the early 40s. And folk used to be used by those who performed it in a public context as music of the people, and you can parse that in all sorts of ways. But it also essentially meant, I think, a music that may have commercial implications and that people may take it, run with it, and make use of it, but it seems to have been driven by other than commercial forces. So when you look at folk as a subset of popular music, most people that we think of as folk are dealing with material that was not written explicitly for a mass market, but for other markets. And in our country, there could be multiple ethnic markets, geographical markets, racial and racial markets, but mostly they were written out of people's personal and community experience. And I think even if you take it all the way from the field recordings of the people that we recorded, that Helen Hartness Flanders recorded, who were singing, recreating, and sharing this music within their very localized communities, all the way up to, let's say, early Bob Dylan in a lowly attended Greenwich Village coffee house, or a hymn singing group in a local village. All of those things might loosely be categorized as folk, because they were being done irrespective of the larger commercial market at the time, and they were directed by impulses other than the commercial market.
Thank you, Lisa. I think we'll leave that question there. Nobody else has got their hand up. And it's well gone 5. We said we'd finish at 5, but I suggest we carry on at least till past, if that's all right with Martin. Wave at me if that's all right, Martin. Carry on. Yeah, thumbs up, right. We do have one other question that was sent in earlier from Sean. Now, I should say, if you're going to send me questions, send short ones, please, because I have to read them out. And before we do this, in case anybody wants to disappear, but is this the sort of thing that we want to do? You know, this online discussion, which I've thoroughly enjoyed and learned some stuff about. If you want this kind of thing, then say so on the chat list, or at the end put your thumbs up or whatever. Please do tell us whether this kind of thing works or not for you, and if so, we'll program it in for the future. Anyway, the other question we've got from Sean, sorry, I have to take my glasses off. There are quite a few songs that are regarded generally as favourites and are much sung and recorded. Firstly, this is to the panel, are you able to shed light on any of the characteristics of songs that become generally favoured? And secondly, what is it about a song that you particularly like that makes it a favourite? So it's not just, I mean, it is your personal favourite, but it's also what makes a song a favourite, apart from everybody likes it. Any of the panel want to start us off with that? Sue?
Can I say the tune and those lovely modal tunes that so appeal? Any variant of Dives and Lazarus is good for me, but especially I like, and it may be a variant, I'm not sure, The Banks of the Bann, which obviously John will be familiar with, because it became the hymn, The Lord of All Hopefulness, which actually became our family's go-to hymn for every occasion, from weddings to funerals. So it's personal associations, but oddly enough, it's tunes rather than words.
So it starts with the tune for
me.
you, and then becomes personal. John Malden?
This is a curious question as far as I'm concerned, so I'm going to have to go out on an Irish limb again, because none of the songs that Shan named is known, or certainly not popular in Ireland, although Searching for Young Lambs does occur. But I just want to share with you a small thing, and that is that I didn't mention the word traditional among the words which I wanted to abandon. Not because it's not a useful word in the context of discussion, but because in Ireland it is a political word, almost. In other words, it means approved. And I'll give you an illustration. In 2002, the BBC World Service conducted a survey, a poll on the world's favourite song. And as a result of the poll virtually being hijacked by the Irish diaspora, a song written in the 1840s, A Nation Once Again, made it over songs from the subcontinent of India, Pakistan, and the first pop song to get on the list at number 8 was Cher's, I Believe, while Bohemian Rhapsody came in at number 10. But there were 150,000 votes, and as I say, it was turned into a political Irish thing. So I would abandon traditional to some extent. But I was asked to look at my favorite, and I find myself having to say that my favorite is one which I discovered for myself in a little poetry book, the Songs and Poems by Hugh McWilliams, and it's called Peace in Erin. And I sing it precisely because it is an anti-political Irish song, anti the usual Irish politics, and therefore very dear to my heart. But that's absolutely idiosyncratic, and I hope the limb hasn't broken under me. Thank you.
No, just bending a little, that's all. Not quite broken yet. Vic, have you got something?
Yeah, it's an interesting song. It's an interesting question in a way. I did a little bit of work on, because I had this idea at the back of my mind, because Sharp said Searching for Lambs was like the perfect folk song. He also said that he had, hardly made any alterations from the source singer. The words are almost exactly as they were sung to me. I went through it looking at the manuscript and the published version by Sharp, and he makes at least 10 alterations to the thing, including one quite severe alteration, and interpolates a verse that wasn't there before. So, I mean, I'm not saying anything other than don't believe everything Cecil said, and it has become a classic song, and it works really well as a song. Okay. Personally, I think Sue's point about the tune is a very strong one. Some tunes just have it. Now, if we knew what the perfect recipe for a song was, I'd just be making money by writing the perfect song. It's a very hard one to sort out. For me, it's both a collection and a song. And the collection is John Broadwood's Songs of the Peasantry of the Weald of Surrey and Sussex, produced in the 1840s. And the song is actually an amazing, I mean, it's a terrible bucolic piece, really. It's a song called Sweet Country Life. A Sweet Country Life is to me so dear and charming. And it's a really classic sort of pastoral piece. But somehow it's got this atmosphere and an amazing tune that's got quite a range to it as well. And I discovered that as part of my interest in songs from the south of England. And the whole collection strikes me as wonderful because it's, if you actually believe that the music of, what can I call it, traditional song, folk song, vernacular song, whatever term, it's very hard to get away from these old terms, somehow sets it apart. We know that Broadwood was a stickler for accuracy. He had arguments with his organist fellow who helped him translate it, and he blew the right notes very emphatically on the flute that he played to get them right. That does seem a different musical world to anything that's happening at the time in England, and it does seem that, to me, to if you like, to show the distinctiveness of aspects of that musical culture of country people in the 19th century. I think that's enough.
Thank you, Vic. David, did you want to say anything?
Yeah, well, as a professional cynic, I was contemplating saying I don't really like any of them, but having heard the clips that Nora played, I realised that's, I can't really say that 'cause it's not really true. But what Sue was saying about being drawn to the tunes, I think is particularly important, and particularly important because I don't regard myself as a musical person, but I think that is a place to start, where we start, by all those years ago, I sort of, bothered to go to folk clubs, apart from the beer. But then I would be looking for some sort of literary historical interest, which again is, why I'm more drawn towards the sort of narrative ballads. But if I had to name particular songs, I think I would name particular performances that come to mind rather than a song at large. So as I mentioned, Fair Thoughts, Sir Patrick Spence, and think back to some of the great revival performances of the 70s, Martin Carthy when he was good, Nick Jones, that kind, Nick Jones's Anarchy Gordon, Martin Carthy, Bonnie Lass of Anglesey, these sort of ones. And then for the more sort of field recording type stuff, you know, Harry Cox at his best would be a place one would always want to go to. So yeah, not sure if that really answers anything, but I'm not so keen on the sort of pastoral frolicking with lambs kind of stuff myself, but each to their own.
Right, Andy Rouse got his hand up.
Hi. Yeah, I'd just like to sort of go off on a slightly different angle here, that for me personally, if I'm sort of looking for favourites, if you like, or songs that become my favourites, I think that coherence of text is also an important feature that I sometimes find it's much easier to learn a really long ballad, which the text of which is so tidy and beautiful, you can't get it wrong, than something that is considerably shorter with fewer words, and you can mix them up because there isn't that sort of wonderful direction that some of the best ballads have. You've got to have the music as well, of course, but very often for me it's the coherence of text which excites. Did you hear that?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Right, fine, yeah.
Thank you, Andy.
Can I just say?
Can you, Sue?
Yeah, I'm just going to a quote from Richard Hogarth from The Uses of Literacy, where he says that, I think I agree with this, hundreds of songs appear with the most unexceptional lyrics, but they catch on only if the tune is catchy.
Who said that, sorry?
Richard Hogarth in
Richard Hogarth, yeah.
The Uses of Literacy.
Uses of Literacy.
Yeah.
I'd like to pick up on something that David said about performance. Because one thing I've discovered recently, I've only just realised this, is that I like best songs from sort of southern England, Sussex type, you know, Sussex and Kent. And it's not the songs, it's the voices, it's the accent, it's the style of singing, makes me feel at home. I know it's a stupid thing to say because I wasn't brought up with this stuff. I came to it like most of us in our teens. But, you know, the singing of a Sussex singer or an East Anglian singer like Harry Cox, that moves me much more than somebody from Yorkshire or from Cumbria or from the West Country. It literally does make me feel at home. So it's not the song, it's the person's voice and the tune, I think, that's really speaking to me there. And I don't know why. I mean, as I say, I've only just discovered it myself. Simon's got his hand up. Simon Fury?
Right, I've just unmuted myself.
Yes.
Yes, there are three totally distinct and complementary aspects to this: music, the words, and performance. And you've got to take all of those three into account, because for the standout thing, I mean, so for, you mentioned Carthy, for example, but there are any number of people who the song really gets you simply because of the particular performance concerned. The words in a song, I mean, for example, an old favourite of mine is By Broom Bisms. The whole thing just holds together nicely just because of the words. The tune's not that important. And then you have other songs where it's the music, it's entirely the music that grabs you. To me, I mentioned this to Martin earlier on, I had just a small discussion. The Siege of St. Malo has the most glorious tune and the most crap words you can imagine. But it still sticks. Simply because of that tune. And it all depends, and different songs will grab you depending on the particular aspects of it. I don't know whether that makes sense.
That made perfect sense, yes. Nobody else has got their hand up, so I'll say something else. What about the fact that, I mean, does it change with your age? I mean, I was listening the other day to somebody singing When You and I Were Young, Maggie.
Oh.
which I have always dismissed as a sort of parlour ballad, sentimental nonsense. And yet now that I'm over 70, and I heard this guy singing when I, remembering when you and I, it brought a lump to my throat. And all of a sudden I understood why the people in the past liked these sentimental songs that we now deride, is, because I'm now grown up enough to appreciate it. It means something now. So has that happened to other people? Are you?
Can I say something about that song?
Yeah.
One of the most memorable musical experiences of my life. When I was playing with Steve Harrison, who's now sadly dead, and Annie Dearman. We did a gig at lunchtime in the Peace Hall in Halifax, which is a strange marketplace building that's built like a Roman marketplace, and there's all sorts of stuff going on. There's a few drunks in front of us on sitting on the lawn, and we just had a PA. We were just singing songs, and it was just a sort of fun summertime gig. Annie sang when you and I were young, Maggie, and people at the stalls stopped. They stopped, they looked, for the whole duration of the song, and then when it had finished, they moved on and carried on shopping. Amazing. I've never had a musical experience quite like that, but I think it's actually a very well-made song, and the imagery in it is pretty interesting when you get in that second verse, the marble, the palace of marble and all that stuff. I think you're quite right. You've got to look at some of those Victorian sentimental songs and not discard them, because in the society where death was common and the death of younger people members of family was common, those songs are very, very meaningful to people.
Yeah.
Finished.
Thank you, Vic. Tim Johnson has his hand up.
Hi. Yeah, I wondered if we could briefly go back to a point that Vic made earlier about musicians bringing a lot of baggage to research on these topics. And as a musician doing research on this, I wondered if you could expand on some of the pitfalls that you think we're particularly susceptible to falling into.
Yeah, Vic?
Right, okay, put on the spot. As I say, I've just read this. I'll have a private sort of Skype conversation with you if you like, because it is very interesting. And having spent the last part of my working life as a faculty member in a music department, there's a lot of stuff that goes in at the basic training level of musicians. Like if you do harmony and standard harmony, you're supposed to, make sure that you avoid parallel fifths and parallel octaves and various things like that. And it seems to me very hard for people who've had that sort of training, when they come to judge traditional music or any form of vernacular music which doesn't correspond with that, to not somehow refer back to that as some sort of standard. That seems to me the problem. Now, I think, I'm not saying it's impossible for someone with a musical training to do good research in this area. I'm sure it's possible. But I think it requires a degree of self-awareness and a self-re-education to do it properly. And what's interesting is the sort of sociological fact that people have done advanced research in this area have tended to have a background in literary studies or history or librarianship, or that seems to be the thing. It doesn't, on the whole, it hasn't attracted. I mean, even Sharp was basically he did his degree in maths, and he was a sort of well-meaning, quite well-skilled musical amateur. And it's since that generation of Vaughan Williams and Moran and so on, who really wanted to use the stuff as an impetus for their own composition, the interest, the attitude of conventional musicology has been to sort of park it on the side and not worry about it. I used to get this sort of oh God, he's talking about folk music again, you know, but we know all of that. Cecil Sharp dealt with that in 1907, that sort of attitude. Now, that's not always the case. I remember going to talk at City University, and a very interesting music department, and people like David Cooper, who's done the stuff on some of the Irish collections at Leeds University. I mean, they're classical musicians that are trained in that way, and they have achieved really sort of interesting results. But I'm just saying, we all come with baggage. I mean, there's nothing about, we all bring assumptions and predilections to what we do. The important thing is to somehow try and become self-aware. There's a wonderful bit, it's Halpert, the American folklorist. He says, where do you look for the things that are beautiful, and that in a sense people with that folklore background or folk music background, you know, tend to look in different places to the people with other sort of trainings. But I'm happy to have a sort of, you know, private conversation with you on this.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Really interesting.
Thank you, Vic. We've got several hands up now, so we're going to move to Heather Livingston.
Just to interrupt very briefly, it turns out that hosts and co-hosts can't raise their hand. So Nora had a question which she's not been able to post. And I think Martin did as well, but I don't want to, and I do, but I didn't want to interrupt.
Okay, well, according to my list, Heather was first.
I was just raising mine for Nora actually before we figured that out about. So I was just, you know, wanting Nora to be able to ask her question.
Right.
So I'll mute myself and let Nora unmute.
Right, Nora then.
All right, thank you, Heather. Yeah, so I have a question that's again sort of about the songs. I've studied so far 3 New England collectors, and each of them were looking for very different things in the songs that they were collecting. So Flanders was looking for, you know, child ballads of historical significance, and you know, the older the ballad, the better. And I studied also Eloise Hubbard-Linscott, who was recording at the same time as Flanders, and also in Vermont and Massachusetts and around New England. And she was much more interested in the place that the ballads and the other songs she was collecting had in society and in community. And then I studied Margaret MacArthur, who came much more recently. And she was collecting in Vermont, but she was looking for songs of place. That was what she was most interested in, songs of Vermont and songs that had to do with Vermont as a state and as a home. And so I was curious, as you know, towards the scholars on the panel, what they look for in songs, what it is that they're looking for in songs that they learn and songs that they study, because there can be so many different purposes in collecting. So that was my question.
Anyone from the panel want to? So.
Well, mine was just related specifically, as I said, to place. So basically anything that was found in Cumbria, because so little had been, it seemed, had been collected there. So that was easy as a straight focus.
Anyone else want to answer that one specifically?
I mean, various things. I mean, all sorts of things can interest you. I mean, one of the things I've been interested in is popularity. Why? This question, similar to the thing we've been asked, why do things become popular? That's why I wrote a paper on Old MacDonald Had a Farm, because it is an enormously popular song, and it happens to be a song that dates back to the early 18th century. I've been working for years on a piece on Barbara Allen because it's an enormously popular song. So I'm interested in that whole question of popularity. But I also, you know, I've also written on funeral hymns, which interest me because it's an idiom which sort of died out. I think there's all sorts of things that can take your fancy, you know, it doesn't have to be one thing at all.
Yeah. Lewis Jones had his hand up for some time. Lewis, are you there?
Oh, it's actually me, Jane Jones.
Oh, hello, Jane. Sorry. Hello,
I've
Jane.
been to lots of these things. I don't think I've ever spoken before. But for me, it's, as with Sue, and actually the same tunes. It's the tune. And that started for me when I was at primary school. So if you've got a good teacher that introduces you to these things, you fall in love with the music. And as I went through my school career, which wasn't a wonderful success, I hasten to add. I was blessed with a good music teacher when I was a little bit older, a teacher who was really into folk music and used to take us out for walks, and a large group of us, nothing inappropriate. And then finally, the last music teacher I had when I was in the sixth form was somebody who had a collection of wax cylinders and exposed us to music in that kind of a way. So it sort of becomes indwelling, it's part of you. And it's, for me, it's always the music. Even, I think there are some wonderful tunes, as someone else has said, that have distasteful words. We can always get around that somehow. Anyway, that was all I was to say.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you. Margaret Steiner.
I think I'm, yes, I'm unmuted now. Well, I have several things to say. Favorite songs, whose favorites, but I would, when I was doing field research in Northern Ireland and also up in Canada, one of the standard questions that I would ask my consultants would be, what makes a good song? You know, when you go to learn a song, you know, what is a good song? And the people always said, I mean, the story, the importance of the story, and also people would always say a true song, quote unquote, you know, whatever that truth is or was. And boy, I was going to say something else and I've lost it. And then I have just a final question before the end of the meeting. Since I inadvertently screwed up and got in an hour late, is this session going to be recorded so that I can hear Nora's presentation?
Yes, I think we have been recording. Is that right, Martin?
Yes, except that because there was an awful lot of stuff going on that people couldn't see at the beginning of the meeting, I did miss the first few minutes of Nora's presentation.
Also, I could volunteer at some point and I could talk about the collector. Oh, I remember what I was going to say, but I could give a presentation on Louise Manny, who was the folklorist who started the Miramichi Folk Song Festival, and she had a book called Songs of Miramichi, and she was prompted to do this recording and work under the aegis of Max Aitken, Lord Beaverbrook, and so I'd be happy to do that sometime.
Marge, could you email me?
Yeah, of course,
please?
of course.
Yeah.
And yeah, and then just I was going to say my stress in my own research has always been communities, particular communities and places. All right, and I'll shut up.
Thank you, Marge. Another Margaret Bennett. Are you there, Margaret? You got your hand up? Unmute yourself.
Yes, I've been enjoying this immensely, and picking up on what several of you said, what makes a song appeal, including why would you be so drawn to Sussex songs when you don't even come from there. I asked myself the same question about songs from the island of Lewis. It would be a horror to my mother from Skye. But for me, whether it's a ballad and either language, Gaelic or Scots or English, it's the emotional impact that it makes. It's that thing that grabs you when you first hear it. It's something to do with the performance. It's not always to do with the best voice. The voice can have all kinds of technical flaws. That, for me, doesn't matter in the least. It's perhaps the performance, that it reaches somewhere that the text on the page can't, or a very polished recording can't, but a performance of something that has... So that person who's singing it is obviously what I would call inside the song.
Lovely, thank you. Well, I don't have any more hands up at the moment. John, are you waving to me?
Yes, I am.
You're drowning.
Okay, I'm just not being idle. For me, as far as being attracted to a song, it's a fine performance. It's not necessarily a fine voice. It's a performance which makes me convinced that the singer is to some extent living the song, understanding it, has studied it, has thought about it, either emotionally or actually. And it's, as I say, a strong performance. But for myself, in terms of research methods, there are two things that I try always to do, and that is to get as much information about the song as I possibly can. And thanks to Steve's index and various other things, that is now possible for anybody in the world who wants to do song study. You can build a thick corpus of song texts and song tunes in order to look at their varieties. But the other thing which I always try to do, and which I think cannot be too far emphasized, and that is to always try to accept things not on your own valuation, but on the valuation of the people who sang the songs and within whose communities they circulated. There are some hints of this from time to time. Singers don't often get recorded talking about songs. Singers don't often write about songs, but once or twice collectors have done, and I think that it's enormously important. That's where I discovered, if you like, that the term ballad is used differently in Ireland from a lot of places, in almost a Shakespearean way as it was. But as I say, build a thick corpus and study the people, not the songs.
Yeah, agreed. Mary Emmett, you got your hand up?
Oh, just a very quick thing. Sorry, I've been trying to work out how to raise my hand for like the last 10 minutes. But just a big thank you, everyone, for this meeting. It's been great. I've been really stuck on my PhD recently and completely lost the will to write anything, and I might actually go and write something now. So thank you all. And otherwise, I just wanted to agree with what Vic was saying about being a musician being a bit of a pain for trying to write about traditional music or folk music or whatever we want to call it or not call it. I think I've spent at least half of my PhD, and I've been doing it for 8 years now, trying to basically unlearn all the classical training I've ever had, because it's a complete pain in the bum and is very unhelpful. And considering my PhD is through a music department, I think there's very little music in it. I seem to be stripping more and more music out of it every day, but there we go. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. I'm glad you found out how to put your hand up. John Baxter. John, where are you? Hello, John.
Yes. Hi. Yeah, I wonder whether, I mean, there's a proportion of songs that are seen as traditional that came from the music halls, and you can sort of see that some songs have survived and are really widely sung from that period. And there are other songs that were equally popular at that period that are not sung anymore. So in a sense, there's a sense in which you could look at which of the popular songs have survived and which haven't. So it's sort of a sort of step away from what we prefer to actually look at, you know, what was popular then and what has survived now. I just wondered whether that was, I mean, it's something I'm trying to look at in a very amateurish sort of a way, but yeah, I just wondered whether that was something to explore.
Yeah, we're a bit hamstrung, aren't we, in that the collectors that we know and love so much, you know, Sharp and his crew, didn't collect that sort of thing because it was just pop music to them. So we don't have the body of evidence that we normally start with, and we have to look somewhere else. We have to look in newspapers. We have to look at, you know, other sources, and I think that would do us a world of good as historians to be forced out of our comfort zone, as it were. Somebody else had Seven Savage. Got your hand up? We've not. Are you unmuted, Seven? No.
All right, you got me?
Ah, we got you now. Yes.
Okay. Now, basically, it's I see it as three things. It is the singer, the song, and the circumstance, and that's everything. And the other thing is that one, for the survival of a song, one can mask the other. The song can have its faults, but the fact that it was sung by a very nice singer, or it was a tale your grandfather told you, or you really loved seeing the words, or it was sung at a wedding or something. All these three things add to the popularity. It is how the individual absorbs the song, the conditions of the singing, the surroundings, and the song itself. Now, people were talking about Maggie. I heard somebody I would never think of singing it. The American singer Tom Rush, with a kind of half speaking, half singing voice, do a version of it that was extremely affecting. And I never would have thought it worked, but it just it worked excellently. It's just those three things together, and they can complement each other or mask each other.
Thank you, Seven. I like that idea. The three S's: the singer, the song, and the circumstance. So I think we can all remember that, can't we?
S and circumstance.
Yeah.
Mr. Cumstance has been knighted by the, okay.
Quite right, too. Ladies and gentlemen, have we had enough? Yes, I'm going to take the chairman's view and say, oh, hold on, Doc's got his hand up. Doc Rowe. Are you there, Doc? Unmute yourself.
There I go. Yeah, it's just very quickly, it was something that Margaret and John Malden said, and I suppose the last speaker as well. It's the performance we're looking at more often. And I suppose I'm one of those privileged few that have managed to film a lot of the older singers that we worship, the audio recordings, but it is the performance, the expression. When they're performing, that the history of the song in their minds is written all over their face. The quiver of the lip, the sly grin in the eye, if there can be such a thing. It's all there. And I don't know whether I've just added something very quickly, but I do think we should be looking at the earlier singers, those people that we've learnt the songs from, particularly the revival. It's been interesting to hear that a lot of people are talking about Fairport and Martin Carthy. That seems to be, and Bob Dylan and so on. That seems to be their start. Some of us actually, like Vic, we started off listening to the Wireless in the 50s. And my circumstances was very much that I got annoyed at the BBC telling me that all these things had died out. The songs had died, the dialect was dying, and it was only courtesy of the BBC in the early 50s that we had any of this stuff left. And that angered me, and that's where I started, and that's where I finished now.
Thank you, Doc. And the moral of one thing you said there was always go back to the sources. Always listen to the old guys and gals, because they knew how to do it. Thank you, everybody. That's been really good. I've enjoyed that. Email us or send us your feedback, do whatever you do. Elaine, I don't know if Elaine's with us, but Elaine has volunteered to be our Zoom secretary to try and handle the hundreds of emails that we get after each of these meetings. Don't forget, a fortnight's time we'll be back again, and please do join the TSF at treadsong.org if you want to be ahead of the game and be invited to the next session. That was really good. Thank you very much to the panel. Thank you to Nora. That was lovely. And we'll see you all again in a fortnight's time. Goodbye.